Hello, welcome. Super glad you're all joining us this morning. I'm Dr. Amy Dunlap. I'm one of the faculty members at the Whitney R. Harris World Ecology Center. This is one of our community conservation series, which consists of 3 events, both focusing on some of the most compelling aspects of the Harris World Ecology Center, namely the devotion to community education, research, and the commitment to training students who go on to become decision makers in regions and countries where biodiversity is threatened. The goal of this event series is to provide an inside look into the work happening within the Harris World Ecology Center and some of the important topics facing the world of conservation today and in the future. And before we get started with the event, I have a couple of quick housekeeping notes to share. First is the Q&A. Throughout the event, feel free to leave any of the questions that you have in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those towards the end of our program. Also, this presentation is being recorded. So as you're registered, you're going to get a link that'll be sent in a follow-up email to all of the registrants. So the Harris Center has supported through fellowships, research grants, and travel support more than 300 MS and PhD students from 38, soon to be 39 different countries. And in most cases, those graduates return to their home countries to continue conservation efforts in academic positions, government positions, or conservation NGOs, which are non-governmental organizations. We're incredibly proud of our graduates and their accomplishments. Here, we've invited 3 graduates, 1 US citizen and 2 international scientists, who've taken different approaches and directions in their career paths after leaving UMSL and the Harris Center. We want to hear from them to learn about how they've progressed, what they're doing now, and especially to hear their thoughts about the conservation status of today's world. So we're going to introduce each of our speakers, and then they're going to tell us a little bit about them. So we're going to start with Patty Baiao, who's the director of US programs for the NGO Island Conservation in Hawaii. And she's formerly the director of Amazon programs for Conservation International.
Thank you very much, Amy. Good morning to everyone. Thanks for joining in. And I'll start off by just thanking the invitation to participate in this event. It's been a wonderful opportunity to just even think about back to the Harris Center and see some of my colleagues' faces here and in our prep sessions. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of background of how I ended up where I am. So I was born and grew up in Brazil, and more specifically in that little square in the middle. So that's the federal district and where the capital Brasilia is. And so I grew up in Brasilia, did my undergrad there. I got a bachelor's in biology. And then I moved on to St. Louis and to the University of Missouri St. Louis and joined the Parker Lab. And Patty Parker had the incredible challenge of turning me into a scientist, which she did. And I am very thankful to her every day because I use those science skills daily, both to my personal life and my professional life. And the Harris Center in that context was critical to me developing my professional career and my foundational background in science. So I was very fortunate to have joined both the University of Missouri St. Louis and to be supported by the Harris Center in that journey. When I finished and graduated, so I did both a master's and a PhD in Patty's lab. And when I finished, I returned home to Brazil and joined Conservation International as the director of the Amazon program. And I was in that position for about 7 years. And again, it was an incredible opportunity to witness firsthand a lot of the challenges that we hear about and we study on our textbooks, and to be able to be right in the middle of it, negotiating some of these critical conservation interventions with local communities, but also diverse other stakeholders in the region. And I learned a great deal there, and many of the things I carry today into my professional life was an incredible opportunity with Conservation International. and then later decided to go back to the US. And I am currently based in Hawaii, working with Island Conservation, where I'm the head of operations for the US program, which means I again have an incredible opportunity to oversee all of our US-based programs. So that means projects that we have in islands all over the US. So things like the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, Midway Atoll, and obviously here in Hawaii, Line Islands with Palmyras, off the coast of Alaska with the Aleutians, Channel Islands in California, the Commonwealth of the Marianas, Puerto Rico. So again, I am very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with the people that work in these places, but also the people that call these places home. And our focus with island conservation is to eradicate invasive species from islands to prevent extinctions. So it's an incredible line of work, and I'll be very happy to share a little bit more with you today. And I think that's it. Thank you, Chelsea, or pardon, Amy.
Yeah, thanks. Next we have Lúcia Lohmann, who's a professor at Universidade Sao Paulo in Brazil and director of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation.
Hi, Amy. It's a true pleasure to be here today. Good morning, everyone who's watching us today. And I'd also like to start by thanking Patty Parker for the opportunity to speak. It's really very special for me to be here today in an event organized by the Harris Center, especially sharing the floor with such dear friends and colleagues. Like Patricia, I was also born and raised in Brazil, and which is one of the most biodiverse countries on earth. And since my early childhood, I have been really fascinated by the diversity of plants that surrounded me. And in fact, as a child, I used to collect plant stamps and used to have plants as pets, as you can see here in this photograph. And that's me at age 6, carrying a little cactus. Next, please. I soon decided to follow a career in botany and pursued my undergraduate degree in biology at the University of Sao Paulo. And during my degree, I conducted several internships on plant and fungal systematics that focused on different Brazilian biomes, such as the Espinhaço mountain range of Eastern Brazil, and also the Amazon rainforest in Western South America. Next. At age 22, I moved to St. Louis to start graduate school at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, where I first conducted a non-thesis master's. I then got a conservation certificate at the Harris Center, and then my PhD, which focused on the Bignoniaceae, which is the plant family of the trumpet creeper and the catalpa tree. I was then a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Conservation and Sustainable Development at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And thanks to the amazing training that I received in St. Louis, I actually got a job right away back home at the University of Sao Paulo, where I have been a faculty since 2004. And in 2019, I was appointed executive director of the ATBC, which has been a really fantastic opportunity to contribute to tropical biology and conservation more broadly by supporting research, capacity building, and science communication in the tropics. Next. So, in other words, I'm a classically trained plant systematist who uses a variety of tools to shed light in long-standing big picture questions in tropical ecology, evolution, and biogeography at both macro ecological and macroevolutionary timescales. Next. And overall, I'm particularly interested in determining how the neotropical flora assembled over ecological and evolutionary timescales, and to reconstruct this really giant puzzle on the origin and evolution of neotropical biodiversity, I conduct cross-disciplinary studies that integrate biological information, also with data from the earth and physical sciences. And I also dedicate quite a bit of effort to science outreach and also to turning the scientific information that is produced through my research into policy and decision-making. And the training that I received through the Harris Center was really crucial to how I developed as a scientist. And it's really a true pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. And our last panelist is Noah Whiteman, who's a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Noah?
Well, great. And I'm in the middle of a thunderstorm, so if I drop out, I will try to come back in as soon as I can. We're driving across the country to start my first sabbatical in Vermont. But ironically, I'm in Minnesota right now, which is where I was born, where I'm from a little town in northeastern Minnesota, adjacent to the Boundary Waters. And before I start, though, with my biography, I want to thank Professor Patty Parker for inviting me and Professor Amy Dunlap for hosting this. And it's just absolutely a delight to be back at UMSL virtually, and especially sharing the panel with Lúcia Lohmann and Patty Baiao. And we were, of course, PhD students together at UMSL, so it's very special to be back. And the Harris Center played a really crucial role in my development as a scientist too. And the UMSL biology department, as well as MOBOT and the St. Louis Zoo did as well, which I will share a little bit of detail with you about as I go through my own biography. So as I said, I come from a little town in northeastern Minnesota. I went to a small college, St. John's University, in central Minnesota, run by Benedictine monks. And, there were 15 people in my senior high school class. There were 120 students in this K through 12 school. So I slowly crept out of the Northwoods and eventually made my way down to University of Missouri, Columbia, where I got a master's degree in entomology. But I knew I wanted to work in the tropics. And so I had heard that UMSL had probably one of the best programs in the country, if not the world, in tropical ecology, evolution, and conservation. And so I applied to many different universities, but decided to go to UMSL, and I'm so glad I did. It was the perfect place for me, and especially because we were surrounded by students from other countries, the very best tropical ecology and evolution students from all over, especially Mexico, Central America, and South America. And that was an absolute delight, but also really opened my own eyes to broader questions and just other ways of being. And so UMSL to me was this, I look back and think of it as one of the most foundational times in my life, not just in terms of the intellectual training, but the social and cultural aspects as well. And so I moved to UMSL in 2000 and started my PhD program there and worked with Patty Parker. And Patty, I was, I think, one of her first PhD students in disease ecology, where she was starting a conservation of birds program in the Galapagos Islands in collaboration with the St. Louis Zoo, the Charles Darwin Research Station, and Galapagos National Park. And because Patty had worked on Galapagos hawks and their social structure, I was an entomologist thinking, how am I going to get involved in this research? But it turns out that, of course, birds have parasites that are arthropods. And so I started studying that with Patty. And so we, for my dissertation, focused on the parasites that the Galapagos hawks transmit to each other. These parasites are specific to the Galapagos hawk, and they've been co-evolving with the Galapagos hawk since it arrived in the archipelago. And that species, I remember Patty describing it this way, was the hawk, because it's the apex terrestrial predator, was sort of a sentinel for the terrestrial ecosystems there. And that's kind of was our focus. So I had a really amazing experience at UMSL. The Harris Center funded my first trip there. And that really got the ball rolling on the rest of my career. I decided I wanted to do more experimental work for my postdoc and more molecular biology, but still focused on host-parasite interactions. So then I did an NIH postdoctoral training fellowship at Harvard University in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology and the Museum of Comparative Zoology. And that's when I started working on plants, which I can also trace back to UMSL, because every Friday I would go to MOBOT and take the plant systematics seminar. And so Peter Stevens and Mick Richardson planted the seed for my eventual career that was focused on plants as hosts, which are a little easier to study than endangered birds in an island archipelago. But you know, those times at UMSL where clearly I can trace my current trajectory exactly to beginning at UMSL. And so I was at Harvard for about 4 years. And then I started my first faculty job in 2010 at University of Arizona in the Ecology and Evolution department. And we really focused on plant-insect interactions, which I also learned to some extent from Bob Marquis and others at UMSL. And then 6 years after that, after I got tenure, I moved to UC Berkeley as an associate professor, where I've been ever since. That was in 2016. And so in this year, I became a professor there and also joined, in addition to the integrated biology department where I was hired, I'm now a molecular and cell biology professor too. So I'm 50-50 in the two. And we have a project on hummingbirds. So we still study birds and a neotropical migrant in that case. And so, you know, you can see my career absolutely echoes my time at UMSL. And I'll be forever grateful and believe always in the power of that place. So I'll stop there and we can, I guess, get to the questions.
Great, thanks. We're really thrilled to have all three of you here. And I'm really interested to hear what you think about some of these questions that we have to start for you. Our first one's a bit of a big one. Earlier this month, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report that's been called a Code Red for Humanity. Given this pretty devastating report, what do you see as the top challenges that need to be addressed? I don't know. Lucia, would you like to go first?
Sure, yeah. So let's see. Well, I guess, so first of all, some of the key messages I think that the report brings to us are that, so temperatures are growing at an alarming rate that is actually much higher than anticipated. And the increased climate obviously has many consequences. And we really need to, there's an urgent need to reduce greenhouse gases so we can limit this climate change, right? So how do we go from there? So what are the challenges now? So I think perhaps the first challenge is to make sure that everybody understands the results and implications of this report. And maybe we also need to make sure that everybody understands that we are in this together and it's our planet and it's everyone's responsibility. So we all need to really take immediate action. And of course, the report is a call to action, but it's the report itself, it's a research synthesis. So we really need now to use this report as basis to establish sound policy, both at national and global levels. And perhaps a last point would be that while the report really focuses on climate change, we also need to make sure that the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are really treated as a single one. And the communities of scientists that study climate and biodiversity are not always super connected. And we really need to make sure that all the policy is produced in synergy, really towards mitigating both crises at the same time.
A big task list, but so important. Patty, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I echo and agree with everything that Lúcia shared. And I think one other thought is that because it is a collective crisis, you know, all of us individually and collectively have to assume responsibility for it. And I think there is an element of transdisciplinary action needed. So there's going to have to be a bottom-up, top-down approach to it. There is no other way to go about it. It has to come from all angles. And so at the policy level, you know, the top-down approach, that is going to be critical. And, you know, the conventions, the UN conventions and individual countries' policies will have to adjust as quickly as possible to this new reality that is now in our faces, so to speak, with the report. But the bottom up cannot be neglected either. So it is on everybody to act on their own responsibility and to adjust their lifestyles and their choices and decisions based on the fact that we are living through a crisis that is going to have repercussions to many. And those are not in the future. And that's the other thing. I think a lot of people just put the crisis into the future. And that is just absolutely not true anymore. And we're seeing the effects of climate change already. In those island nations are a good example of, they've been feeling it for longer than we know. And now it's hit home for a lot of us. So I think just adding to Lucia's point that it's going to take both the top down and we have to look for that, and we have to try to influence those policy decisions, but likewise, it has to be a bottom-up approach as well to it.
Great. Noah, what do you think?
Yeah, I just want to echo those two eloquent sets of remarks and say that I completely agree with Lucia that thinking about the biodiversity crisis, which is in large part a land use overharvesting kind of crisis, but it's inextricably linked now to climate change as we imagine the landscape shifting in vegetation zones, right? Agricultural practices, what will be able to be grown where. All of those things are inextricably linked, of course, to the climate crisis that we're in. And then also to Patty's comments about individual action and collective action, that the only way out of this is for us to see it as our problem individually. And then, of course, the levels of organization above us that include our political entities that we're a part of, most of us in some semblance of a democracy, that obviously what will really force change is political action. And that means thinking carefully about who we're voting for and how and why. And also to depoliticize this. This is, affecting everyone unequally, right? That's the other part of it, that there's the major socioeconomic disparities in the world will be exacerbated by the climate crisis as well. So, and I think part of this that it's so hard to grapple with, it's such a huge, complex problem that it almost is like, well, what could I do? Yes, I recycle. Maybe I'll choose to fly less. But I was thinking about examples of success stories, environmental success stories before this panel today. And one of the ones that stood out for me is the sort of solving of the ozone hole that is a much smaller problem in a way. It's like throwing away aerosol cans and changing refrigerants is a much easier problem to solve at some level than what we're facing. On the other hand, it was successful. And that was a global problem, right, that you could see from space that people could get their heads around. And in the beginning, it absolutely was opposed by industry doing away with CFCs. Eventually, they got behind the movement to shift away from that. I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from that. I don't think that they're comparable in scale, but I do think a global problem was solved. And it took a long time to do. It was very incremental. Scientists are the ones who pointed it out, basic scientists, but then it got everyday people to sort of agree and say, cancer rates are going to go way up, especially skin cancer. People were afraid, and that caused them to think, I can change with a little action. Maybe I can have a little bit of an impact. And so there's, I think, lessons to be learned there. And I just wanted to make sure I brought that up. But the ozone hole is definitely dissipating, and that was absolutely reversed by us. And so we are capable of changing the planet for the better. And it is to remember.
I think you're cutting out, Noah, your travel. Oh, there you're back. Okay. Are you through then, or we missed your last time?
I was just saying, I was just saying, I think it's a message of hope that we need to remember that absolutely our collective action can result in positive change, and we can reverse what seems to be, an impossible thing, right? Like an ozone hole. How could that possibly be reversed? And it has been. And so that's a major success story that we have to remember.
Yeah, it's great that you've turned on a piece of optimism that we could think about, in a problem that seemed intractable decades ago. Do you think we can find optimism in this current report and how we move forward? We'll go back to Noah.
Yeah, I mean, I think clarity always helps, right? Yes, there's uncertainty, but as the science matures in climate system research, it seems it is much clearer, right? What our fate is than it was even a few years ago. And that hockey stick that we all it's getting worse in terms of acceleration. And I think that the hopeful message there is that there is still time to mitigate the worst effects of the warming that we're in the process of seeing accelerate. So I think there is a hopeful message. The recipe is clear. And so having goals that not only each nation can set, but even as individuals, as scientists, we need to really think hard about even our own international travel, domestic travel by air. We need to, rethink the way that we interact, and maybe that's okay. Maybe science will be more open. Maybe more people can participate if we go, for example, do a small thing and do virtual conferences, things like that. So I think there are some hopeful parts of this that in the end, will the planet warm at least 1.5 degrees? Yes, that is going to happen. So I sort of feel like being in denial is no longer an option. And I think that's a good thing.
Awesome. What about you, Lucia? Are you optimistic?
So, yeah, well, yeah. So despite seeing the report, I think there's definitely room for optimism. And I was just thinking that I think that the reason for that also is twofold. So first, because we have a lot more technology and tools and opportunities and knowledge that is actually relevant to solving this crisis than we ever had before. And also because I think we are finally having a much increased awareness. So I think that society as a whole is finally realizing that climate change and biodiversity conservation are really not just a mission of academics or NGOs, but something that everyone needs to address. And we are actually starting to see climate and biodiversity emerging as priorities in the agendas of the private sector as well. So nowadays, a company that contributes to sustainable development goals is much more likely to thrive just because there's consumer pressure and society no longer wants to support initiatives that damage the environment. So I think this change in how people are seeing the problem and the fact that it's reaching all sectors, I think that's a really important thing and a big reason for optimism.
So what do you think, Patty?
Yeah, no, I agree with both Noah and Lucia, and I'm a firm believer that nothing gets done without optimism. So we need to find it. And I think the report does provide optimism. I think that understanding is and moving away from denial is the first step, right, into any recovery process. And I think if you compare the current report to previous reports, this is really not new. Scientists have been saying this for many, many years now, and reports like this one have come out. But if you compare them, the message is so much more clear and much more articulated into solutions. And here's the path forward. And that's where optimism lives, right? Because when people can grasp reality and they have a path forward to rescue them, so to speak, rescue all of us, the planet, I think that's where solutions start appearing and becoming streamlined. And I think that's the challenge, is that our individual actions have to get streamlined into society. And if, outside of denial, that is a much easier thing to do. So I do think that there is a lot of room for optimism. And, you know, to quote Christiana Figueres, the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention person that is behind the Paris Agreement, you know, that stubborn optimism has to motivate you daily. Otherwise, it's just, you can't get anything done. So yeah, there's definitely a message of hope there, and I hope people see it that way out of this crisis.
So one thing that's come up in what each of you has said was the role of the individual, you know, that things have to happen at each of these levels. So what can an individual do, like all of our participants who have come to watch this, to boost conservation efforts and have a positive impact? Like what actions do you think are most effective for individuals in pushing an immediate change? So Patty, what do you think?
I think it's decisions, right? Yeah. So it's the everyday decisions that we make as consumers and as citizens of our nations. But I think the biggest one is decisions on how or who, I guess, governs our nations, right? So voting well, I think, as Noah pointed out, you know, knowing why and why are you voting for your representatives and what they can do to support overcoming this crisis is probably the most important thing for all of us in our different nations, countries, local governments. So getting good representation of in government is essential for the top-down approach, right? And then the other thing that I always come back to is that we cannot be silent, right? So we have to, and it is a thing that, you know, falsehoods, lies, they travel much faster and they penetrate much quicker than truth, right? So, and especially in the social media world, that is so much true, much more true. So I think, you know, isolating ourselves in our little bubbles is probably the worst thing we can do. And making sure that we are reaching outside of our bubbles and countering the lies or falsehoods and making sure that accurate information is being provided and at least included in the dialogue so that people can't get away with perpetuating lies. I think it's very important. And it's something that I take very seriously, and I try to have a very diverse interactions with people. It's not easy, and it's frustrating and all that. But it goes both ways, right? So you understand where they're coming from too, and that helps you inform and share information in a way that can be a little more successful. So I think it is our role to continually share accurate information, and we can't isolate ourselves in our social bubbles, which is a lot more comfortable.
Yeah, that's definitely become apparent about many things in science lately. Noah, you had mentioned voting. What are some other actions that individuals can take?
Yeah, and it's, you know, I just want to thank Patty for those comments. I completely agree. And in terms of holding our politicians accountable, I think that is really important too, because as we've seen in the United States, for example, gridlock in Congress can prevent real action from happening, right? And it's a very difficult problem. But on the other hand, you know, politics is very local too. And so there are things that we can get behind in our own municipalities that can have an impact. For example, getting rid of your lawn is probably one of the best things that you could do for the environment, and figuring out what native vegetation you could plant there is one of the best things to decarbonize the atmosphere in our, you know, that something that we can control as individuals. There are small actions like that we can take, but it also sends a message to neighbors. You can talk about it. And to Patty's point about getting out of our bubble, I talk about climate change wherever I go, whether it's to give commencement speeches, I fold it into my evolution class. And I think we all have a deep responsibility as scientists to engage with the public, including with people who might not agree with us or might not understand some of the basics of what we're talking about. I think we have to have patience and engage people of all political stripes. We can definitely have conversations that are difficult. We're trained to do that as scientists. We have to remember that. And that if we stay in our own bubble, that also does damage that kind of passive behavior. So I think we have to engage with everyone we can on this topic and remember that small actions can reverberate, but we have to also lead by example. And so, you know, I'm thinking very hard, as I said before, about the kinds of travel that I do and how I do it. And I think that, you know, these are the kinds of individual actions besides voting that we can take, and consumer decisions, as Patty and Lucia were talking about as well. That this also puts pressure on politicians, right? Especially in the United States, where lobbying is such a huge part of the political process. Money talks, and consumer choices can probably have some of the biggest impact on policy decisions.
I'm taking notes from this. This is very inspirational. What about you, Lucia?
Well, yeah, I really thank also Noah and Patty for those comments. I think these were perfect. And I just would like to echo some of these points. And so from a scientist perspective, I think they already emphasized the importance of communication. And my general feeling is that as scientists, we used to communicate by showing numbers. So this number of species are going extinct, and, you know, and it seems to me that we need to, in some ways, change our narrative and start talking by speaking a language that is accessible to everyone and that really touches people's feelings. And so in some ways, maybe we need to really be creative in the way we communicate and engage with, you know, artists and involve theater and poetry and films and literature and find ways to communicate the message in a way that is really engaging and inspiring, so people can really understand the importance and take responsibility on what is happening. And I think it was also mentioned that, well, that we all need to rethink our individual and collective consumption patterns, and use wisely the resources that we have. And perhaps one point that we haven't mentioned yet is the need to really broaden the community of active participants. So in some ways, I think we really need to think about, okay, so we are conserving biodiversity, to whom and how, and really think about a lot of the local stakeholders who are some of the people who are most affected actually by the climatic and biodiversity crisis, and really perhaps change some of our approaches and listen and co-produce and involve them in the whole process, so we can really incorporate different stakeholders in the decision-making process.
It seems like a lot of you think very broadly, and your role as a scientist is being much more than simply the science that you do. And so I'm curious about the role that the Harris Center did for you in your career in developing this. And related to that, the things that you learned that have been really useful in your career, and what do you think that we could be doing better in educating our next cohorts of students that are going to go out there and try to solve these problems? Lucia, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Well, I can't emphasize enough how instrumental the Harris Center was in really, well, not only providing me with the scientific background, but especially also training me in the social sciences and bringing this broad perspective that you mentioned. So all of us have very broad perspective, and that's really due to the Harris Center. And so I think the Harris Center really brought the importance of multidisciplinary research, including the social sciences. Through the conservation certificate, I took several courses with social scientists, which were really crucial. And also something that Noah mentioned, even the international nature of the center also allowed me to see very early on the importance of these diverse voices for conservation biology. And so these are topics that people are talking a lot right now. So multidisciplinary, diverse voices. But I'm talking about being exposed to the Harris Center, which was the ICT at the time, and learning about all these issues back in '96. So the center was really ahead of its time, and 25 years ago was already forming graduate students that were thinking very broadly and about global issues and about how we could take our research from theory really into action. And perhaps in terms of next steps, one thing that I've been thinking a lot, and we also mentioned here, is the need to communicate more broadly. So perhaps bringing in additional professional skills. Sometimes people talk about soft skills. I like to use the term professional skills because I think it's not soft skills, it's really something truly needed. And really skills in communication and leadership and conflict solving and interpersonal skills. And I think these kinds of training would really contribute to solving some of these conservation issues, which are actually social issues.
Great, thanks. Noah, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I completely agree with everything Lúcia said. And for me, I was thinking back at my time, and I remember being asked to present on my research to the board of the Harris Center and to other stakeholders as a graduate student. And that was both intimidating. It was, I remember going to a small conference room and, somewhere in either downtown or in Ladue, and thinking, wow, I'm a second-year PhD student. What do I know? Yet here I am. I'm speaking to these very distinguished members of the St. Louis community, as academics as well as business people and political people, and thinking, wow, this is an amazing opportunity, and it sort of forced form. And doing that repeatedly, as we all know, that makes us better scientists, but it also makes us better teachers. And it also forces us to think, how do I relate to this person who's very intelligent, but from a completely different world? How can I make them interested in parasites on birds? And so by studying such an arcane topic, but being in the Harris Center forced me to think like, well, how can I generalize my research, both to basic science, but also conservation? And that was very helpful as I moved forward in my career, just in terms of allowing myself to gain the self-confidence, and as Lúcia said, the professional skills. And so I would encourage the Harris Center to continue allowing, encouraging graduate students to present their work to the public, but also to the board as much as possible. So that's one, it sounds like a little thing, but to me, it was actually quite a big thing. And it also made me feel like my research was important. So it was this positive feedback loop. And, I was thinking in terms of maybe what we could be doing better as individuals. And I don't know if this necessarily applies to the Harris Center. It may. But one of the things I think about, and we talked about this a little earlier, was, this idea of our bubbles that we're in. And in particular, my experience in the United States is that scientists generally don't do a very good job of communicating to the public, especially people who, might be from very different places in the country. And I think that is to our detriment as a society and as scientists, because science is inherently a political endeavor. We are embedded in a political systems wherever we are. We have to navigate within those. We inform them, and we are individuals with our own political minds and opinions. And it's ridiculous to think that they can't inform the other or shouldn't inform the other. And so I used to think that scientists need to be really unbiased and apolitical. And I think that is just an impossible oxymoron. And so what I think now is that our job is to communicate clearly what the facts are. Of course, we have our own political identities, and perhaps we can ourselves step outside of our own comfort zone as scientists and go into communities that we might think might be hostile to us. Well, how do we know? Have we really tried it? And so I think that as scientists, especially grad students, getting them out there in communities that might be challenging, I think is important. And not just to talk to people who agree with us about especially topics like the biodiversity crisis and climate change. And so, I really appreciate everything that Lúcia said about the Harris Center as well, at being a sort of epicenter for cultural interchange. And I also took classes Latin American history from Eduardo Silva, and those were formative in my understanding of the role of the United States in both destabilizing and stabilizing the political economies of countries that are at the heart of the biodiversity crisis.
Great. Well, Patty, you have deep experience in NGOs, which is a little bit different. A number of our alumni are in NGOs. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I will have to agree with both Noah and Lúcia on. I think the essential things that the Harris Center did for me were embedding me in a culturally diverse environment. So having that, as an international student in the US, that was extremely important, not just for me to feel comfortable and able to participate fully, but also, as Lúcia pointed out, just exposed to so much more, and I became so much more culturally aware of differences, even within my region, the Latin American region, and how diverse we really are. Up to that point, I had very little interaction with my South America neighboring countries, and so that was essential, I think, to what I see myself today as a culturally aware and how I approach communities in the work that I do in the NGO context, and respecting and really emphasizing that double-way street. It goes both ways, and in communication and in conservation, we need to be open to co-producing and co-managing and co-creating solutions with communities. And I think the Harris Center provided that very foundational beginning to that in creating an environment that was so diverse. And the transdisciplinary, that was the very first introduction to transdisciplinary that I've ever had in my formative years. So the bachelor's degree I had in Brazil was very much that. It was very biology center, and I didn't, to a fault of my own, didn't reach out to other departments and didn't take courses outside of that core. And the Harris Center forced that into it. And I think it was very prolific in that way. And to be honest, the career path I chose was single-handedly decided by the Harris Center. As part of the certificate program, I was an intern with the Nature Conservancy, the Missouri chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And it was through that experience that I decided that was my passion, and that's what I wanted to do with my science degree. And so it was the one experience that led to my career choice. So I can't thank the Harris Center enough for all of the formative influence it had for me personally and professionally. And I think just looking forward, and I agree 100% that the center has always been ahead of its time, and I believe it continues to be ahead of its time, and just operating in the crisis mode that we need to be operating on is an important way to continue being in the forefront. So things like conflict transformation and leadership training and things that will make sure that we continue to produce individuals that can handle crisis and then can transform crisis into opportunities, I think is what the Harris Center has done very well in the past and will continue to do into the future.
Great, thank you. Well, now we're going to open up this conversation to questions from our attendees. So if you have a question for any of our speakers, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and we'll see about answering some of these. Our guests have already answered some of the questions because they've given such good broad-ranging answers here. So we'll start on a couple of these. I'll just go through. We're going to do one for each of you pretty quickly. And the first one is to Patty. You explained how you made this decision to go into the direction of NGOs and what some students could prepare. But if a student wanted to follow in your footsteps, is there something else that you would recommend that they do that you haven't mentioned so far?
I think it's a hard decision to make, right? When you're in an academic program, the forces pull you towards academia, right? And I think the first thing that I would recommend is continue to detach from that idea that the only way to success is academia. And I'm not by that implying that, you know, my own success or anything like that, but there are ways to use your science background and to affect change and to really be a scientist outside of academia. I will for sure say that I use my scientific skills every day to make every decision in the career path that I followed. And without that scientific background, I would be very ill-equipped to perform in the positions that I've had in the past and currently. So I think the first thing that I would recommend is to really force yourselves to think of science as a broader way of operating in the world. So that was one very hard thing for me, was to break away from the notion that academia was the obvious path forward, and I was breaking away from it. And then the other thing I would highly recommend is getting exposure, right? Like with anything else, you may have ideas of what this really means, but without exposure, we're exposed to the academic, pathway, right? And we know what that looks like. We have role models to follow within academia. So looking for those opportunities of exposure to new role models in the NGO world was very important to me. Once I found role models that were operating in that category with their science backgrounds, it became very clear to me that that's what I wanted to do too. And so internships are obviously a good way to go about it, but there's volunteer work. There's all kinds of ways that you can get exposure to the NGO journey. And the other thing too, and I think that goes without saying, but and probably a mute point to a lot of people thinking in that career path, is that it's mission driven, right? So every NGO is mission driven. So you're not in for the money, and obviously, and then you really have to be passionate for the mission of that one organization that you decide to work with. Or create, if you're going to go, create your own NGO. So it is mission driven, and if the mission of the organization doesn't speak to you, it just won't work out, because you really have to pour your heart into it, and so I really encourage people to find what it is, because there's many things you can do, right, in the conservation arena, and there's many different missions that you can follow to contribute to the crisis solutions. And so finding what it is that you really want to contribute and following that mission and that passion, I think is the way to go about it.
That's great, thanks. Our next question is for Noah. You mentioned your work in plant-animal interactions and working on things like parasites on birds. Can you explain how that's, integral? In other words, what are the risks of losing what might be considered small components of biological communities?
Yeah, I think as E.O. Wilson has said, it's the little things that run the world, right? And so if you imagine a world without small things, what goes away are many of the ecosystem services that we rely on to grow our food, to decompose our waste, and even, to generate the air that we breathe. And so for me, it was always a little tough thinking like, wow, how can I make research on lice of birds relevant to the broader world? But I also think, when I was setting up that challenge for myself, that the Harris Center gave me room to be okay with myself doing something basic, right, in terms of research. And it gave me the runway to kind of think about how to develop that into, as I said before, a more generalizable kind of way of thinking about conservation biology. And eventually it did. And, Patty and I wrote a paper on Parasite Co-Extinction with their hosts, because of course, when the California condor was brought into captivity in the sort of, reintroduction program, unwittingly, veterinary scientists deloused those birds and they caused a louse to go extinct, Copocephalum californicum, that was on that bird. And you might think, well, who cares? It's a louse. On the other hand, you might think that, well, species interactions as we know them, what that means is that the louse helped make the California condor what it is, right? Maybe it shaped its immune system. Maybe it shaped how the feathers evolved. Maybe it shaped its behavior. And so I think the lesson that tells us is that there are unintended consequences of even thinking like, well, we should get rid of mosquitoes, all of them, because they're just causing human disease. And you might be able to convince me that we should get rid of some of the Anopheles species that are vectors for malaria, but there are always unintended consequences, particularly when we're talking about invertebrates, small things. And so what I would say is, I took about the most extreme in terms of being esoteric, entity. And with the Harris Center's help and the support of scientists there, was able to eventually move that into a space intellectually that I think that had a bigger impact in terms of conservation. And so I'm grateful for that. And as someone who just inherently likes insects, it's always a hard sell unless it's a butterfly. But I think, as I said, I think the environment that was allowed me to become cultivated in this milieu, where it was acceptable to study plant, insect, or bird parasite interactions. And that really gave me the self-confidence to keep doing what I was passionate about.
Great, thanks. We have a question for Lúcia, which I think will be kind of short to answer. You're active in the governance of some important scientific organizations. Have you ever considered having a role in politics more generally?
Actually, I have to say that had never crossed my mind, actually, but I should probably say that I feel like I'm really a botanist at heart. And the place that I'm most happy is in the middle of the Amazon, just walking around and looking for my plants. In fact, the tabebuyas are flowering right now. And all the time I want to stop my work and go for a walk just so I can see them. But slowly I started being invited to participate in some of these international panels like Diversitas, or some committees that are associated with the government and producing national reports, or the science panel for the Amazon. And initially I even thought, oh, that, it deviates a little bit from my actual research, but I saw it even as a duty of, okay, this is the contribution I can make of really getting my research and taking into policy and action. So I guess I've done the research and then also worked a lot in, governance and capacity building and synthesizing research in some major reports. And I guess that would be the last step, but it has never actually crossed my mind.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we have less than a minute left. And our wrap-up question, which I think you've all already answered so beautifully, are suggestions for students that want to have an impact in conservation. And I think summarizing it has been, be really good at communicating science, learn as much as you can about different cultures. Remember that you're going to have to communicate with lots of people, and to be broad in what you're learning. Does that pretty much sum up the big, big things. You all said so many, I don't know, I took a lot of notes.
Maybe I would add just one final thing, which is to perhaps have very clear goals, very clear conservation goals, and select your battles carefully. I mean, we can't do it all, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed and sometimes discouraged given the magnitude of the climatic and the biodiversity issues that we are facing. But I think if we have very clear goals of what we can achieve and what we can contribute, then we can really focus and use our time wisely. So I think that would be perhaps my last thought to some of the people starting.
Great. And that's a very good thought to end on, which unfortunately, I think we could talk for hours. Thank you all so much for joining us, our panelists, and thank you all of our participants for coming and watching and learning about some stuff. I hope it was super thought-provoking for you. And thanks again.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thanks, Patty and the Harris Center. This has been wonderful. And Patty and Noah, I really loved learning from you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you very much, Amy, for hosting us. And thank you to the Harris Center for bringing us together. Noah and Lúcia, it's been great to see you.
Yeah, this just reaffirms that I made the right choice with where I went to graduate school. And I feel like it's a family that I'll always have. And, you know, I was delighted to be here today. And I learned a lot, as I always do when I interact with UMSL colleagues. And the very last thing I'll say is, you know, pursue your passion to the students and try not to get discouraged. It takes a career, you know, you have a long career ahead of you. You can't do it all right now, but stay the course and make sure that you get your degree.
And publish your work.